It is somewhat easier, but still challenging, to reconstruct the nature and the beliefs of Pharisees. But it helps that we have the writings of two of them that we know quite well, Josephus and Paul. The Christian apostle Paul is a Pharisee. He tells us that he's a Pharisee. Josephus is a Pharisee. And it is to be borne in mind when you read his histories that he's knowledgeable about Pharisee Ism and favorable towards the Pharisees. The Pharisees are a broad and extremely powerful group. They have a much more grassroots power structure, not a narrow aristocratic elite like the Sadducees, but an influential movement. The Sadducees fear the Pharisees and compete with the Pharisees. The Hasmoneans, Herod, and the Romans alike will seek the favor of the Pharisees. There is a temptation, which is inevitable, to see the Pharisees as the predecessors of rabbis, sort of proto-rabbis. What does rabbi mean? It just means teacher. And what does Mary Magdalene call Jesus in the Gospel of John when she sees him resurrected? As my teacher, Rabboni. The Pharisees, in some ways, seem like early rabbis. They are pious teachers, leaders of the synagogues, learned in the Jewish law, who maintain the oral traditions of Judaism. And there's an element of truth in that image. But it is more common to say Rabbinic Judaism begins with the destruction of the temple. Rabbinic Judaism is the form that Judaism assumes when there is no longer a temple cult, when there is no longer a caste of Sadducees, when the religion is forced to grapple with the effects of the destruction of the temple. The Pharisees, many of them probably support the Maccabean rebellion and at times support the Hasmonean dynasty. Certainly they are largely willing to live under Hasmonean rule, but will regularly come into conflict with the Hasmonean kings. The power of the Pharisees comes from their influence over the rank and file inhabitants of Palestine. They are not aristocrats. They derive their power from moral influence. The most important traits of the Pharisee are learning in Jewish scripture and law, but a belief that the law requires interpretation and that there is a body of interpretation that has been built up by generations. The Pharisees, unlike the Sadducees, believe in an afterlife. In some ways, their image of God is of a more elaborate, more rational, more just God who will punish the wicked and reward the good in the afterlife. But above all this, Phariseeism is about personal piety. Personal piety through the Jewish law. Now think about what that means. The basic ideal of Phariseeism is that Judaism, that the covenant between God and Israel, can be experienced by the ordinary person through his or her own life practices. For the Pharisee, the essence of Judaism, the essential part of Judaism, is not so much temple sacrifice, although they certainly support and adhere to temple sacrifice, but most importantly, personal adherence to the law, personal righteousness, adherence to table purity, kosher, maintenance of Sabbath purity, prayer, tithing, the study of the Torah. The individual can follow the law of Moses in obedience to God. And this allows the Pharisees geographically to be powerful on a much broader scale. The Gospel of Mark introduces us to Pharisees throughout Galilee in the north, although they too would certainly have been centered in Jerusalem. Now, as we will see when we turn to the Gospels, the early Christians will cast the Pharisaic devotion to the Torah, to the law, in a negative light. in fact, as hollow. We will see Jesus struggling with the Pharisees over questions of the law, over fasting, over the Sabbath, over divorce, over questions of purity. In Mark, which as we will see is the earliest of the Gospels to have been written, the Pharisees are part of the plot against Jesus. In Matthew, written somewhat later, the opposition between Jesus and the Pharisees is even more pronounced. The Pharisees are not a hereditary caste like the Sadducees. In fact, there's no clear organization or structure to the Pharisees. They're a diffuse, grassroots religious movement. Not revolutionary, not secessionist, but not accommodationist, as the Sadducees. They are the moral center of late Second Temple Judaism, truly trying to call forth the best in the commitment to the Jewish law, but at the same time, not radically seceding from society or radically, violently opposing Roman rule.